If I ask myself what makes us human, then one answer jumps out at me straight away. It is not the only answer, but it is the one suggested by the question. What makes us human is that we ask questions. All the animals have interests, instincts, and conceptions. All the animals frame for themselves an idea of the world in which they live. But we alone question our surroundings. We alone refuse to be defined by the world in which we live, but instead try to define our nature for ourselves. The intellectual history of our species is to a great extent shaped by this attempt. Are we animals like the others? Do we have souls as well as bodies? Are we related in the order of things to angels, to demons, and to gods? All science, all art, all religion, and all philosophy worth the name begins in a question, and it is because we have questions that human life is so deeply satisfying and deeply troubling too. Not all questions have an answer. In mathematics and science, we solve our problems as well as creating them. But in art and philosophy, things are not so simple. Hamlet's great soliloquy starts with a famous line, "To be or not to be, that is the question." The play revolves around that question. Would it be better not to exist? Is there anything in human life that makes life worthwhile? When confronted by the extent of human treachery and scheming, we fall into complete contempt towards our species. Is there some trick of thought, some perception, some argument or some appeal to higher authority that will restore the will to live? When I look at the great artists of the past, I am often struck by the extent to which their work has evolved in response to a question. Milton asked himself how the flawed world in which he found himself could be the work of a supremely good God, and his answer was Paradise Lost. Bach asked himself how variants and permutations flow from the basic moves in music, and his answer was the art of fugue. Rembrandt asked himself how the soul is revealed in the flesh, and what the lights and textures of our bodies mean, and his answer was his extraordinary series of self-portraits. In art, it is always as though the question is what the work is really about. Milton's poem implants the question of man's relation to God in the centre of our consciousness. It doesn't answer the question, but instead creates wonder and awe in response to it. Wonder and awe are the diet of the artist, and without them the world would be far less meaningful to us than it is. The same is true of philosophy. Although there are philosophers who give answers, it is usually their questions and not their answers that have survived. Plato asked how it is that we can think about the property of redness and not just about red things. How can finite human minds gain access to universal realities? Plato's question is still with us, even though few people today would accept his answer to it. Aristotle asked how it is that there can be time and change in an ordered universe. Is there a prime mover who sets it all in motion? Few would accept Aristotle's answer to this question, but the question remains. How can there be time, change, process, and becoming in a world that could as easily have been permanently at rest? Kant asked how it is that human beings who are part of the natural order can freely decide to do this rather than that, can take responsibility for their decisions and hold each other to account for the consequences of their acts. Kant was honest in acknowledging that the question lies beyond our capacity to answer it. But until we have asked it, he implied, we have no real understanding of our condition. In the monasteries, libraries and courts of medieval Europe, the big questions were constantly debated. People would be burned at the stake for their questions, and others would cross land and sea to punish people for their answers. In the Renaissance and again at the Enlightenment, the big questions were asked and answered. And again, death and destruction were the result, as in the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, and in the French Revolution. Communism and fascism both began in philosophy, both promised answers to the ultimate questions, and both led to mass murder. Our nature as questioning beings seems to have a huge cost, and maybe we are no longer prepared to pay it. Certainly, if we look around ourselves today, we see a mass of ready-made answers and very few attempts to define the questions that would justify them. Should we then give up the habit of asking questions? I think not. To cease to ask questions would be to cease to be fully human. The challenge, which has shaped my own life as a writer, is to ask questions, but gently, and without insisting on an answer.
Philosopher Roger Scruton, thank you very much indeed. We'll talk in just a moment, but first let's play your chosen piece of music. This is An die Musik by Schubert. Well, I can honestly say we've never played that before on this show on Radio 2. I'm racking my brains. So thank you very much, Roger Scruton, both for that by Schubert and also your essay on what makes us human. And in summary, it's the asking of questions.
Yes.
Which is your whole life, I guess.
I guess it is.
Let's go back to where it all started for you. You grew up in Buckinghamshire with two sisters, and immediately I think of rural idyll.
Well, it was not a rural idyll. It was a semi-detached, pebble-dashed house in a rather miserable street, but it did have the great advantage that it backed onto the railway. So my childhood passion for train spotting was immediately satisfied.
And interestingly, between your parents, between your mum and your dad, there was this amazing class tension.
Yes, I mean, England was like that in those days. It was almost like a D.H. Lawrence novel. You know, my father identified himself as working class, although, of course, he was a primary school teacher, so to that extent had risen above it. But he felt total solidarity with his family of many children brought up in the slums in Manchester, and he felt the one thing that he could never accept was to be a class traitor. So for him, the Labour Party, the working class, and the trade union movement were as it were, the cornerstones of his life. And even in your name, there's the disagreement, because I understand he wanted to call you Roger, because he felt that was a proper working class name. Your mum said he's got to be called Vernon, which is your middle name, because that's a more upwardly mobile name. Exactly. She was from the genteel suburbs of London, not from a successful family. They're sort of lower middle class, but they had aspirations. And Vernon seemed to them like the name that a proper gentleman would actually bear. And of course, it was the great punishment of my childhood to be carrying that sissy name. At a certain stage, I decided that anybody who called me Vernon had to be beaten up. Until he called me Roger, and that was my sort of rite of passage, if you like. And when your father was out, I read somewhere that she would bring out the china cups and drink coffee and have her friends round and read gossip magazines and live a different life almost. Exactly. That it was rather like that. She was a very gentle and wonderful person. None of this was intended maliciously. It was just that her nature was to settle around a table with other peaceable creatures and dream about a better world. But were you conscious that your father was also not living the life he wanted to live? Yes, he was very disappointed that he couldn't rise in the teaching profession because he didn't have a degree and he didn't have a proper qualification, partly because of his working class origins. His father just insisted on taking him out of school, age 14, so that he wouldn't get above himself. And that meant he didn't get above himself. And he really seriously wanted. I mean, he's a highly intelligent, energetic man who was frustrated. And this is something that I'm sure many people have been through of that generation, the way in which the structure of class feeling, as well, created obstacles in the way of everybody's life. Because I would imagine that would make you a bit of a revolutionary, but it seems the real moment in your life came with the 1968 student riots in Paris, and you decided, I don't want any of this. Exactly. I'm afraid I am a revolutionary against revolution. Let's say I rebelled against the whole atmosphere of rebellion that was in the air at the time. I had just finished my Cambridge degree, and there I was in Paris. a wonderful place, enjoying this beautiful civilized city, enjoying French culture, trying to understand it all. And there were these people in the street, as it were, throwing it all away, trashing everything and smashing things up. And I thought, life isn't about that. Life is about the great achievements and how to preserve them, not how to demolish them.
When I described you as a conservative philosopher, that was small c conservative, wasn't it? That's almost your instinct is to keep things as they are unless there's a very good argument for change. Is that right?
That's the sort of thing, yes. I would say, that, to put it another way, that human achievements are few and far between, and if you can identify one, hold on to it.
Now, of course, that attitude, you correct me if I'm wrong here, caught you slightly the wrong side of things in the Eastern Bloc for a while, didn't it? Is that right? You ignored the Prague Spring because you thought, well, hang on, there go the students again.
Yes, I did have that feeling. I didn't. I was totally ignorant of all the post-war political order at the time, and I think I was. I thought we really. Order is more important than rebellion in all circumstances, even a rebellion against communism. I was, of course, wrong in the way I thought about it, partly because it wasn't a rebellion to overthrow things, it was a rebellion to restore things.
But you went out there, and I think it was the late 70s, was it? And you then completely changed your mind.
Oh, yes, totally. When I went there and saw exactly what people there had been deprived of and what they had been trying to, as it were, repossess themselves of, which was essentially their country, and its culture and its peace and its way of life, then of course I was totally on their side.
And that's particularly Poland, Czechoslovakia for you?
Yes, Poland and Czechoslovakia. I also felt Hungary has always appealed to me too.
And any particular moment you can tell us about from that period, late 70s, 80s, when you start to think, OK, I'm on their side?
Yes, there was a particular moment where a friend of mine invited me to give a talk in Prague. I happened to be at a conference in Poland, so I said, yes, OK, I'll go. And she said, well, look, you just have to turn up at this particular apartment at a particular time and give your talk on whatever you want to talk about. I said, I'll talk about Wittgenstein. And then, so this was, to me, I didn't realise at the time that this was, of course, regarded by the authorities as a huge offence, that one should be talking to a private seminar and not to a public institution. So I found a room full of silent people awaiting me, and two policemen outside the door who tried to turn me away. And then I got quite cross, and I said, no, I'm supposed to be giving a talk here. And I pushed my way in, and I did manage to give the talk, but afterwards I was thrown down the stairs by one of these guys, and I realised that, this was not the simple thing that it seemed, and that indeed I had actually addressed what was regarded as an illegal gathering, and I thought, to make this kind of thing illegal is absurd. And the young people who attended afterwards gave me some intensive tutorials on the situation, and of course I changed completely into my outlook on it.
And are still very much in touch now with those countries, I know.
Yes. I and various friends set up a kind of underground relief mechanism for them, and we became very friendly. Eventually I was arrested and thrown out, but I, by that time, had a huge network of friends, and that has stayed with me.
So why are questions so important? Why does it make us human?
Well, a question is something which doesn't merely raise the level of your consciousness of other things. It also raises the level of your consciousness of yourself. You are the questioner, and the questions have a habit of turning round on you, rather like mirrors, and saying, "Who are you to ask this question?" And so you're given a jolt. You're given a sense that maybe you don't fully belong in this world in which you're trying to understand, and it's you who's the oddity, not the world.
I'm just conscious we've got a lot of busy people listening to this show. We've got mums at home, we've got salesmen and women in cars, we've got dentists, and they don't necessarily, we don't have time to stop and ask, what am I doing here? And you worry if you ask that question, the philosopher's question, life falls apart at that point.
Yes.
You said you'll come home and say to your husband, "What are we doing here?"
I think, yes, people who ask these deep metaphysical questions at every moment of the day are great bores. But
I'm glad you said that.
Yes, but you have to learn to contain them. And I actually think that's one of the purposes of art. It helps us to contain them. That little song that we played by Schubert, An die Musik, is a perfect example of this. It sings, the song sings in praise of music as the thing that relieves us in these grey hours of doubt. Music is, in a way, a soothing response to these questions. It tells us, you're not going to answer that question, but since you've got it, here is something which will enable you to live with it.
But don't you feel when you see a newspaper article that says the oldest man of the world has just died, he was 112, and it's always a peasant in Romania who's not got any money but has just been outside tending his vegetables for the whole of his life?
Yes.
Don't you feel that somehow your questions are bad for you? He didn't ask any questions. That's why he got to be 111.
That's one's always tempted by that view, but there's another and rival view, which is that living that long without asking a question is pretty pointless anyway. And mightn't it be better to live more intensely and die a bit sooner?
What do you think jolts people into asking questions?
Well, many things. I mean, there are the tragedies jolt you into. If you lose someone, lose your parents, your wife, or child, their questions are immediately assail you. But other things, there are pleasant jolts into the world of questions. For instance, the experience of beauty. Just you wake up in some fine summer morning, you see the sunrise, and you suddenly realise that this is beyond anything that you could have yourself created or even can fully understand. The fact that you are here confronting this extraordinary plenitude of being, how can that be? That's a question-inducing moment.
You're making me think of the film American Beauty, where, of course, the middle-aged man is exposed to the incredible beauty of one of his daughter's friends. His whole life falls apart as a result.
Well, yes, human beauty is not quite as simple as the beauty of nature, because it is connected with sexual feeling as well. It can be provocative, and it can be a kind of judgment, the perfectly beautiful person who stands in front of you, making you realise what a shabby thing you are in comparison.
So we need to keep asking, but if we don't get answers, does that worry the philosopher? Because you, in a sense, you gave us a question from Plato, who is... What is it, 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
We haven't even got an answer to that yet.
Well, I know. You're absolutely right. One of the purposes of questions is to find an answer. Another purpose is to maintain yourself in a state of doubt. Living in a state of doubt makes you, in a way, much more amenable to other people. You know that you're not entitled to impose your view upon them. You're not entitled to bully them around, because deep down, that your world and their world is fundamentally uncertain.
Tell us how you met your second wife, Sophie, because the story is a good one.
Well, I suppose it is. Yes, I took up fox hunting late in life, and I at a time when I had not being a good rider, I naturally had a tendency to fall off my horse. And I was introduced to this young girl out hunting one day, and I thought, how extraordinary. There should be an intelligent person in this incredible crowd of people who shows some desire to talk to an old geezer like me. And, as galloping along one day, the normal thing happened. I ended up in a ditch. Normally what happens is everybody then goes on helter-skelter, leaving you, because after all they're not going to spoil their day for a silly old fart of a philosopher. And I sort of look up, and there is this angel standing above me, saying, "Are you all right?" And helping me back onto my horse, even though losing thereby one of the great moments of the day. So I thought, I can't, after all, be such a piece of rubbish if this happens.
So you've been together nearly 20 years.
That's
She
right.
was 22 then, you were 50.
That's right.
And you have 2 children?
2 children, yes.
And does that happy family situation settle some of the questions for you?
Yeah, absolutely. This all taught me that many of my questions are self-induced. You know, that they come from, in a way, put it this way, by living in a state of questioning, you actually can sometimes be taking a shortcut to selfishness. You know, there is an answer, for instance, to the question of loneliness, and it's not sitting down and just enjoying it. It's going out and meeting somebody else and giving your life to somebody else. So that there are all kinds of questions that afflict lonely people, the answer to which is not to be found in the questions, but in the existence of another person, you know, and that other person changes your life.
Roger Scruton, philosopher, thank you very much for joining us on Radio 2 for What Makes Us Human.
Thank you for inviting me.